In this year of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee and Her Majesty's passing, I think it would be apposite to dwell for a few moments on one of Her Majesty's quotes. Let us not take ourselves too seriously. None of us has a monopoly on wisdom. So we have to ask the right question. And as I've put on the slipcase, we sincerely and humbly acknowledge our debt and gratitude to science, but there is something missing. And is it because of this spiritual vacuum that's been created by a monopoly of scientific materialism and the excessive domination of secular values? That's the question we're asking. So let's hear from someone who knew a thing or two about such matters.
Our age is proud of the progress it has made in man's intellectual development. The search and striving for truth and knowledge is one of the highest of man's qualities. Though often the pride is most loudly voiced by those who strive the least. And certainly, we should take care not to make the intellect our goal. It has, of course, powerful muscles, but no personality. It cannot lead, it can only serve. And it is not fastidious in its choice of a leader. This characteristic is reflected in the qualities of its priests, the intellectuals. The intellect has a sharp eye for methods and tools, but is blind to ends and values. So it is no wonder that this fatal blindness is handed on from old to young, and today involves a whole generation.
That was Albert Einstein in the dark years of 1943. Now, we seem to be so enthralled by this prevailing mechanistic worldview that we have forgotten the subtleties of what it really means to be human. So, we humans should now get used to the idea that we are no longer mysterious souls. We are just hackable animals. That's what we are. Loudly and proudly proclaims the intellectual priest who has met with the heads of state in Europe and a keynote speaker at the 2020 World Economic Forum in Davos. The politics of knowledge, of course, demands that we never question the authority of experts, even though there is a bit of funny logic here. If we were no longer mysterious souls, means we once were, but that's not playing the rules of the game, according to the elite intellectual priests. But we can see how such a crude ontological reduction of the human being to a complex biological machine in need of an upgraded operating system, like a computer, how this has impoverished our sense of values, and the disintegration we see around us is ample proof of this. So the equation for our century, the equation for the century we live in now is this: B times C times D equals AH. And this is said in all seriousness at the World Economic Forum. Biological knowledge times computing power times data equals an animal hackable? So what's the answer? Here, our response on the slipcase again is saying that we have undoubtedly derived considerable material benefit from science and technology, but we have forgotten the key, the perennial philosophy, which reveals the spiritual origins and the true nature of the universe and man. Now, Einstein once said that if there were an issue on which his life depended, and he only had an hour to solve the problem, he would spend 55 minutes asking the right question and only 5 minutes resolving it. So it's so important to ask the right question. First, we have to know who we are. And the ancient eternal saying, man, know thyself, inscribed at the temple of Apollo at Adelphi, is as true then as it is now, even more so, much more so now. But we have to ask the right question, and the trouble is we confuse levels of perception and categories of meaning. We confuse objects with phenomena. Let's imagine this scenario. A child on the playground goes down the slide, and because she comes down at far too steep an angle, and therefore the velocity is far greater than it ever should be, she knocks a tooth out. Now, the slide manufacturer is called to redesign the slide. As far as he is concerned, all he's bothered about is a mass coming down a slope. The transformation of potential energy to kinetic energy. The mass could be a child, it could be a stone, it could be a piece of wood. All that matters is that a particular mass comes down at the right velocity. So this is a pure physics problem. It is mechanics, nothing more. He is only interested in the weight coming down the slide, say 3 stone. Say now the child goes to a dentist because she knocked a tooth out at the bottom of the slide. Here's the tooth. The dentist is not interested in what the child weighs. He's only interested in the tooth as an object, in her mouth as an object. So the child is a human being, of course, but from the dentist's point of view, he's interested only in the tooth as an object. It's a problem in biology, in mechanics. But now say the child, after seeing the dentist, because of a horrible experience, remembers it when she's a grown-up adult and discussing this awful trauma with a psychiatrist. Now, is the psychiatrist going to say, how much do you weigh? Did you weigh 3 stone as a child? Do you weigh 8 stone now? No, he's not interested in that. He's interested in the inner being, in the soul, in the mind. So he has to ask the right question. If he says, what do you weigh? He's not asking the right question. The tooth that the dentist is interested in is really an object that he has to set right. The psychological problem is not an object, it's a phenomena. And we confuse objects with phenomena, and hence there is so much confusion in the world. And we confuse categories of meaning. What applies in the physics situation does not apply in the psychiatry situation. So does science explain anything? Does science explain or just describe? A woodpecker pecks 20 times per second without concussing its head because of its specialized beak and skull mechanism. Yes, we know this. But which ornithologist designed and made this? The cheetah can achieve 70 miles an hour in 3 seconds because of its rear muscles, large heart, and wide nostrils. Yes, we have discovered this. But which veterinary scientist designed this from first principles at the drawing board? Likewise, the giraffe can reach up to 17.5 feet. But how is it that the large heart, the light head, and the valving in the throat all came together as an orchestration such that the giraffe could fulfill its evolutionary function? Who was the veterinary surgeon who designed it? And regarding the human eye, it is incredible that the outermost layers of the cornea are designed to stop the ingress of water, because if water ingressed the cornea, it would be a bit like driving with your windscreen all fogged up. So there is a pump leak mechanism involving a chemical exchange and a pressure that's built up in the stroma. This is an incredible discovery by science, by medical science. And as a result of that discovery, wonderful corneal surgery and treatments have ensued. But which doctor designed the pump in the first place? They've only discovered it and described it. And likewise, the aeroplane depends on Bernoulli's principle and Newton's third law. But Newton certainly didn't create his laws, neither did Bernoulli. So you can see what I'm getting at. As Sir Arthur Thomson, the great naturalist, said, the vulgar belief that science has explained everything is a hopeless misunderstanding, and it's nearer the truth to say that science has explained nothing. And Hardy, Ramanujan's great mentor, said that he believed mathematical reality lies outside us, and our function is to discover or observe it. And what we, in a grand way, refer to as our creations are simply the notes of our observations. So without laboring the point any further, what is philosophy's main contribution to science? It is not to deny the wonderful contributions, but to enter the scientific camp and raise it to a higher standpoint, to point out the noumenal causes, hidden and unseen, behind the phenomenal manifestations. And this is the province of the esoteric philosophy. The perennial philosophy, I don't have to describe it to a group of eminent theosophists, other than to point out that these words obviously have a nuance of meaning. The Gupta Vidya puts the emphasis on the divine aspect, Theosophia on the godly wisdom, wisdom of the gods. The Prisca Sapientia is the sacred wisdom. The perennial philosophy is the perennial wisdom, and Fritjof Schuon, the Swiss mystic and philosopher, referred to it as put the religious aspect to the perennial philosophy. But why perennial? Because, as Albert Schweitzer so beautifully observed and remarked, that he likened it, perennialism, to a tree that annually bears fruit, the same type of fruit, but never exactly the same fruit, symbolizing that the universal wisdom, ever one in essence, must periodically be given new expression and communicated in an updated idiom to suit the epoch in question. Why such significance to the perennial philosophy, which is also known by all sorts of other terms, of course, like the thread doctrine? And the thread doctrine is so called because, like a necklace thread that strings together all the beads and creates an organic unity, so the thread doctrine passes and strings together all the philosophical, scientific, and religious systems and reconciles them on the basis of universal precepts based on eternal verities, not on beliefs. So here you see how the thread doctrine, the reconciling thread, unites science, religion, and philosophy. And the approach, of course, is holistic rather than reductionist. Now, esoteric, of course, simply means hidden, pertaining to the innermost, the noumena, the unseen causes that underlie outward phenomena. And occult science, the related term, means, of course, concealed, penetrating deeply into the causal mysteries of being, the science of the inner workings of universal nature, physical and psychic, mental and spiritual. But these teachings, these mystery teachings, the esoteric doctrine, these teachings are not a panacea for all the ills of the world of any age, but such is their stature as the source of all true traditions that they contain the overarching solution to the problems of any epoch. But this does not mean that the teachings disseminated through the great sages and philosophers had foreseen and analyzed every complexity of this or other generation, but rather that the teachings had evolved a method whereby the mind was so trained in the fundamental verities of life that it was able to cope intelligently with any emergency that would arise. So, for example, an expert motorist can hardly be expected to anticipate or to know about every pothole, every traffic light, every roadblock on his journey. But by virtue of his driving skills, he can negotiate these obstacles and problems and reach his destination. Likewise, the eternal wisdom, the teachings, are based on the divine order of existence, based on eternal truths. For it was realized that problems, individual and societal, stem mainly from man's character and disposition, and only very secondarily from economic and material factors. And likewise, the health of the body depends largely on the health of the mind, which is a truth that our world leaders and their scientific and medical advisors have realized at best very partially, if at all, as they grapple with the medical, human, and humanitarian disasters that have beset our age. So unless we look behind the world's problems, material, economic, into the real and spiritual problems which they reflect, we cannot probably understand them or properly resolve them. So with that fairly extended introduction, I'd like to present the overall contents of these volumes, these 4 volumes, but also to highlight their purpose and what value they serve and what is their relevance to our present age. So a route map through the 4 volumes, always pointing out this organic process, a route map through the 4 volumes, purpose, relevance, and contents. So volume 1 is really a panoramic survey contrasting science with the perennial philosophy on consciousness and man. Volume 2 is a microscopic examination of man's nature, his internal geography, so to speak. And volume 3, having looked down into man's nature, we now gaze through the telescope and see why man is known as the measure of all things. And volume 4 contains resources and further material. Highlights from each volume: essentially the scientific and esoteric worldviews, especially the soft and hard problem of consciousness, and the contribution of enlightened science before we deal with the mystery teachings. Volume 2, the subtle bodies, death, and the transition of consciousness, paranormal phenomena, wet computers and computers, a huge, almost neurotic debate in science whether the brain is no different in principle from a computer. And finally, in volume 2, the united message of all world religions. And volume 3, symbolism and mythology, evolution, the latent powers in man, and emphasizing the primacy of consciousness. So volume 1, science contrasted with the perennial philosophy. The core question we ask is this: Schrödinger realized that science knows everything about the physical mechanisms whereby, for example, air waves strike our eardrums, and then there is a neurological process to the brain. But why is it that an old song can move us to tears? How do we account for experience? Which is why he said we do not belong to this material world that science constructs for us. So volume 1 is in 2 sections, applauding the achievements of science and justifying the need for a perennial philosophy. Realizing again what Max Planck said, that until we include ourselves in the last analysis, we will never understand the mystery that we are trying to solve. So section 1 of volume 1 prepares the ground, and here are the various chapters: identifying the mind-brain problem, the paradigm of science, its limitations, and then we strain our eyes to see beyond, and we see a new continent of thought. Section 2 justifies the need of the perennial philosophy to complement, not to discard science, to complement science. The mystery teachings, what occult science affirms, the mystery teachings, and a recapitulation. So the overriding message of volume 1 is to demonstrate that the realm of truth can only be approached by moving beyond and rising above the plane of intellect, as Einstein fully realized in that excerpt I showed you a little earlier. A few highlights from volume 1. The paradigm of science and its assumptions is a complex chapter, and such complex chapters open with a tabular summary of the various sections through the detailed content. So, for example, the major section headings, subject matter, and intended purpose, is the way I've presented a route map through a complex chapter. And in simple terms, science is still definitely mainstream science, I mean, it's still definitely grounded in the Vienna School of Logical Positivism, which in simple terms says this: I can only be certain what I experience through observation, which depends on my senses, which are physical, which can therefore only respond to physical experience, which therefore are governed by the laws of physics. So even though there may be things I can't see, I can't verify them, they're meaningless, and the supernatural is irrelevant, or it can all be explained on the basis of brain states. Now, the great William James, one-time member of the Theosophical Society, the great father of American psychology, in the 19th century, he identified this problem that psychologists are saying thought is a function of the brain. Yes, it is. But what kind of functional dependence? The first functional dependence, the usual, is productive. Like steam is produced by a kettle, so they say thought is produced by the brain. Like bile is produced by the liver. The second functional dependence is not productive, it's releasing. The crossbow does not produce the arrow, it releases the arrow. So it's a permissive function, it's a letting go. But the third, the most important, is transmissive. And here the great psychologist quoted from the wonderful sublime poet Shelley, life like a dome of many-colored glass stains the white radiance of eternity. And the whole point of meditation, as I see it, is so that the many-colored glass can become pure colorless glass, so that the radiance of eternity is not stained. In other words, the refractive index, so to speak, is minimized. So we can see the analogy between light and life. As a prism splits white light into its colors, as we go through life, all our experiences, all our baggage are like this colored glass that refracts the white light into all of these qualities, all of these characteristics that we all experience. Here is the outpouring of the perennial philosophy, the evergreen tree producing its branches and its fruit. The mystery teachings about man I've summarized in the following way: the purpose which is always to unfold man's inner nature, the mysteries of antiquity, the Theosophical movement, and related 19th century spiritual teachings. Always bearing in mind that the consummate achievement of the mysteries is man united with himself, attained by raising the lower nature towards the highest grade of perfected purity and functioning. And this knowledge of how man's composite nature can be most speedily unfolded constitutes the secret doctrine of all ages and the main objective of the mysteries. And the only mystery I'd like to concentrate on and emphasize is the Greek mysteries, because they're so, I don't like to use the word easily understood, because they're not, of course, but they're the most easily communicated. And I'm talking here of the Bacchic rites of the mystery school, and they are based on the allegory of the god Bacchus being torn to pieces by the giant Titans, who then scattered the dismembered body of the god far and wide. Now, Jupiter, the father of the of Bacchus and the demiurgos of the universe, beholding this crime, hurled his thunderbolt at the Titans, reducing their bodies to ashes. And from the ashes of the Titans, the human race was created. However, the ashes of the Titans also contained a portion of the Bacchic body, which the Titans had partly devoured. Therefore, the mundane life of every man was said to contain a part of the Bacchic, therefore godly life. And accordingly, the Greek rites taught that earthly man's composite nature comprised his lower nature, consisting of fragments of the giant Titans, and his higher immortal nature as the sacred life of the god Bacchus. So the Bacchic state signifies the unity of the rational soul in a state of self-knowledge, and the Titanic state, the diversity of the rational soul, which by virtue of being scattered, loses the consciousness of its own essential oneness or unity. And we all know how our judgment is compromised when our mind is scattered and we lose our self-knowledge of our own unity and rationality. And how did the giants accomplish the fall of Bacchus? By getting him to be engrossed with his own image, signifying engrossment in the sea of illusion, Maya, which signals really the downfall of man. Hence, ordinary man is capable of either a Bacchic rational existence or a Titanic irrational existence, and for the very vast majority, of course, both in varying proportion. So given the hordes of holidaymakers in pre-COVID days and now thronging major tourist sites, tossing their silly little selfie sticks, are human narcissistic traits basically any different? Beauty products, fashion industry, celebrity culture, all to do with getting fascinated by ourselves. We can't get away from ourselves. Where were these great teachings disseminated? Just two examples: in India, the wonderful Elephanta caves and the world-famous Ellora caves. And all of the Ellora caves and Ajanta caves are cut from the top of the mountain down And we're talking of hard basalt rock, no cement, no mortar, no glue. So you can just imagine how the cave diggers, the archaeologists really, and much more, envisioned the final product that they created with such beauty. And it is of the deepest significance that after he made his historic venture through ancient Iran and into Hindustan, the legendary Pythagoras remained for several years as a pupil and initiate of the learned Brahmins of Elephanta and Ellora. And in fact, the name of Pythagoras is still preserved in the records of the Brahmins as Yavanacharya, the Ionian teacher. And then after returning from his travels, Pythagoras established his famous school in Crotona, where he taught the secrets of mathematics, music, and astronomy, considered by him to be the triune foundation of all arts and sciences. The great Pythagoras, revered by the greatest mathematical and philosophical minds the world over, the great Isaac Newton being, of course, one of them. So far, then, we've seen the triumph of science. And what science has given us is the discovery of everything from the largest scale, the macrocosm, relativity theory, right down to the micro scale, quantum theory. But what is missing is mind. It is a triumph of mindlessness, which doesn't mean scientists and physicists are mindless. It means mind has not yet entered the picture. So as Professor Bernard Carr points out, the new physics must include mind, must invoke mind, not as a product of matter, but mind in itself. So we now need to look on human beings from a higher standpoint through the lens of the mystery teachings of world cultures that does not exclude but transcends the dictates of scientific materialism. This quote Tim very kindly gave me, the Vishnu Purana, and we need to see it in its contemporary setting. Thank you, Tim, for this quote. Now, where's the evidence for that? Well, only a week ago, here's the evidence from The Observer. See this piece about women will be objects merely of sensual gratification. And in The Observer, we see that there is barely a scene where Marilyn Monroe, in a biopic, a dramatized version, isn't topless, crying, being raped, or having a forced abortion. No mention of her activism. Revealing photo shoots in magazines are justified on the grounds that celebrities taking the empowering choice to go naked. More evidence you see in the Times. I find this hideous that girls of 12 now are now being given the choice. Do you want to be a boy or a girl, basically? And if you don't want your breasts, in the UK, a charity is promoting the desirability of this idea. And Mermaids is the charity for gender non-conforming children to give them a binder to wreck your breasts and make you breathless. So, who are we? What do we mean by a human being? At one time, it was thought that you are your genes. So your genes determine your intelligence, your genes determine this, the genes determine your strength, your this and your that. Have a look at this. Who do you think said that? Who do you think proposed the compulsory sterilization of the feeble-minded? This gentleman. Winston Churchill, also known as William Churchill, age 36. And in his letter to Asquith, he recommends that the feeble-minded should be restricted, and he proposed using X-rays to sterilize men and women. Now, this is shocking coming from such a great person, but it just shows how an idea in science is taken over by politicians, and then there is a toxic output from this. And the result of this, of course, was the science of eugenics. And I needn't remind you how it is one of the contributing factors of the Holocaust. But there is another way, I suggest, of refining the human being, a far better way of refining the human being. It is this.
Musicians have in their weapons flowers, not things that kill. We bring joy, hope, peace, brotherhood, love with capital L. So music is important not because it's an entertainment. Many times we see everywhere music considered as entertainer. Music is not only a profession, but is a mission. That is why we do this work. So mission for what? To make the society better. To think about the new generation that in one complete year has been deprived from deep thinking all the time about health. Health is the first most important thing, but also the health of the mind. And music helps. So my message to the governors and presidents and prime ministers everywhere, in every part of the world, consider culture always as one of the primary elements to have a better society in the future.
So here is the clear message that if you want to create a master race, rather than tinkering around with genes, if you expose people, young children in their education, if you expose children and adults to great philosophy, sublime music, noble poetry, mystical literature, and theosophia, you will get the master race, and there are no side effects. It is not like taking medicine that creates side effects. By emphasizing the culture of the mind, and theosophy in its widest sense provides just this culture, which was known subliminally by great poets like Robert Browning, who realized that we have, well, one soul, of course, but what does it mean? 3 souls, 1 man. So volume 2 is in 3 sections on occult science, on man's composition. Is man just a biological machine? And the perennial philosophy. Section 1, dealing with man's occult anatomy and physiology. The occult constitution and nature of man. the three primary vehicles of consciousness, and then a substantial chapter on death is transition, time at the door of eternity. Section 2 on man's brain and mind, clarifying common misconceptions, and then strongly arguing that we are not just lumbering robots, and our brain is not merely a wet computer. And section 3 on the unity of the perennial philosophy on man's internal landscapes. Internal, of course, therefore esoteric and occult. The diverse classifications of the composition of man and how we construct and energize a man. So a few highlights. The great teaching of Plato, we all experience. Sometimes we ask ourselves, why do we do what our conscience says we shouldn't do? But sometimes, how is it that we act virtuously? So in the key to theosophy, of course, and elsewhere, we are told that psyche, the soul, has a choice either to ally itself, to become friends with Nous, God Bacchus, the spiritual soul, in which case all will be well, or it can descend and attach itself to the irrational animal soul, Anoia, which creates all the problems. And in the tarot card, this is beautifully symbolized by the youth who has two maidens on either side, and both love him. And this is the whole point. They both love him. Your virtues and your vices both love you. But you, the youth, have to choose where your allegiance lies. So the double nature of the mind principle is a central teaching of theosophy and the perennial wisdom, for that matter. And here is a very simplified diagram, which I needn't explain to a theosophical audience. The mind principle, of course, the mind is one, but it functions in two different ways. It's not what it does, but how it does it, to what end it does it. And Ian McGilchrist's wonderful work, The Master and His Emissary, is a great philosophical and psychiatric exposition on the double nature of the mind principle that can either rise to Nous or descend to Anoia. So it's our choice whether we want to behave like the Minotaur or rise to the stars. Therefore, there is a spectrum of consciousness, a spectrum ranging from unspeakable brutality to ineffable transcendence. Picking that up, we think the ego is the problem, and often it is, but it's not the ego per se. It's whether we use the ego as a servant, as an emissary, or whether the ego dominates the master, our higher nature. When we use the ego as a servant, we can lend everyone a helping hand. When it dominates our higher nature, we trample on the fallen. So we see this spectrum of consciousness. And the various qualities are, of course, here at the higher end, and here at the lower end. And just two examples, very contemporary examples of the extremes of this range. Here you have someone saying, we have various weapons of destruction and we will certainly use all means available to us. And I'm not bluffing. Another great person, our queen actually, has pointed out that everyone is our neighbor, no matter what race, creed, or color. I don't know if Her Majesty was familiar with the first object of the Theosophical Society, but whether she was or not, we can certainly say all great minds do think alike. The subject on death and transition is a major one, and the chapter is complex. And I put it to you that if all of these great people taught the continuity of consciousness, and that death does not mean an extinction, we need to explain to the world, so to speak, about the higher states of consciousness. And death is not the ending of everything. So the process described in detail is life on Earth, the two levels of post-mortem existence, and the next terrestrial incarnation. And that process being, in the simplest terms, the life on Earth, the first transition, the divine self inhabiting the Kama Rupa, so to speak, life review, and the Hades state, existence in Devachan, the spiritual awakening, and then the next incarnation. The point being that consciousness is one, but like H2O, it can exist as ice, water, and steam. So these are the various phase states of consciousness. A central teaching of occult science is the Antakarana. And whether you inhabit Purgatoria or not, or to what degree you do, depends on your spiritual life support. Acting as the medium of communication between the higher self and its child, the personality, functioning as that umbilical connection, and that death, the conveyor of all thoughts of a spiritual nature that can be absorbed into the higher self. So with the average man, think of the Antakarana as an electrical conduit supplying an electric current from the higher self to energize the child, the lower self, so to speak, the personality. If we continually think horrible, vicious, evil thoughts, that electrical connection is going to be thinned and thinned even further until ultimately it will snap. And when that snap occurs, we have the Jekyll and Hyde phenomena, what's known as in occult science as soulless men, human monsters, and a scourge. Equally, by our aspirations, our nobility, our altruistic behavior, and our generosity, we can strengthen that connection and add more to this umbilical connection. And that would account for the sage, the seer, and the genius in any field. The chapter on harmony with major world traditions is organized in this way: the Theosophical tradition, the Eastern traditions, and the Western traditions, not neglecting the modern transpersonal traditions of Ken Wilber and also Steiner. So, for goodness sake, don't read this. It's just to show you the level of detail, the parallels with the Egyptian, Indian, and Zoroastrian traditions. The whole point is to show that whichever tradition you look at and examine, they can all be based and harmonized with the basic theosophical occult tradition of the septenary constitution. Likewise, with the Greek tradition, whether you consider Plato and Socrates or Pythagoras, all their various classifications can, not artificially, but quite naturally, be harmonized with the septenary constitution as taught in Theosophy. And the great Leibniz always emphasized the need for a harmony of philosophers, as above, so below. So as white light is diffused through a diverging lens, we can regard the various teachers as fulfilling a sort of diverging lens function, where the white light of truth is split into the various teachings, which are not contradictory, but mutually complementary, depending on the age they were given in. But our job, the second object of the Theosophical Society, never given enough emphasis, in my opinion, is we, by our comparative study, we provide a sort of converging lens to bring these various colored streams together and so recreate below the white light given from above. How do we construct a man? How are we made? Well, exactly the same way as you make a house. You need the physical foundation, the physical body. You need the apex. You need the divine self. And you need the various intermediary platforms or stories of the house: the spiritual soul, the human soul, the animal soul. Three souls which make up one soul, as Browning pointed out. And we function, think of a power station with very high voltage from the power station having to be stepped down by transformers to the domestic houses. So the three transformer stations are the equivalent of the spiritual soul, the human soul, the animal soul, which steps down, so to speak, the voltage and current of the higher self to a level that the physical body can handle. Let's remind ourselves of the contrast between the exoteric and the esoteric. All of this frenetic search for life in the universe is based on this ridiculous idea of trying to identify life purely in terms that we see it or we consider it, unconscious of the fact that there is no dead or blind matter, because these find no place among the conceptions of esoteric philosophy, which never stops at surface appearances and considers the universals as realities. So volume 3 then, in 3 sections dealing with symbolism, the Hermetic axiom, and evolution. Symbolic representations of unity of nature, cosmos, and man, and then symbolic representations of the principles of man, showing why man is the measure of all things and why symbolism is the language of the mystery teachings. The Hermetic axiom, absolutely vital. The unfolding of consciousness on cosmic and terrestrial. Anthropogenesis, the unfolding of consciousness from the divine self to the human. And these two chapters are, I would suggest, the most important and the most difficult, answering the question of how physical input to the external senses can result in an internal experience. And this was Schrödinger's question. And the answer is here, not because I'm so clever, but I've put together the various teachings, mainly from Sankhya philosophy, but also from other sources, to show how this happens. Man's limitless evolution, described from the standpoint of the perennial philosophy, but certainly not limitless from the standpoint of Darwinism, of course, before we summarize and move towards our final epilogue and mathematical codicil. So just a few highlights from volume 3 before we close. Symbolism, the Druidic tradition, talks about the silent pool fed by 4 underground streams, which then flow outwards. And the 4 underground streams are the narrative of the legend, universality of the wisdom, understanding our transpersonal nature and personal gnosis. And these external streams represent man's senses, the life of the senses, the 5 outward senses. And the message here is there is no question of denying the enjoyment of the senses and castigating the body, but as long as the senses are fed by these 4 underground streams, then all will be well. How did the world and man come into being? This wonderful saying of Schiller, that the universe is a thought of the deity. And since this ideal thought form has overflowed into actuality, the world born thereof has realized the plan of its creator. Now, what happens when something overflows? When your milk pan overflows, the milk doesn't hit the ceiling, the milk flows downwards onto 2 levels. Firstly, onto the stove and then the floor. So similarly, this overflowing into actuality represents different degrees of externalization of the original impulse. So in the Kabbalah, we have deity in repose, deity emanating, and the boundless light. 3 factors: repose, awakening, activity. In the Kabbalah, the microcosm, we have the unmanifest and the manifest worlds. And in the microcosm, the human being, over here. And the tree of life beautifully knits this together and shows how we can discover the whole original design, because the universe is a thought of the deity which has overflowed into actuality. The lotus, the ancient symbol, the physical body, the petals that fall off, the inner petals, the subtle bodies, if you like, but the seed pod linked to the universal essence, the seed pod that creates new flowers, not the same flowers, but new kinds of flowers, in the same way of perennialism as described by Schweitzer. Modern science is fixated on the brain and considers the heart only as a pump. But there are three main consciousness centers: the heart, the brain, and the generative center. And what the brain does is to provide the link by which thought, through rational intelligence, life and form, are united. The heart is the source of life, the generative system, the source of power through which physical organisms are produced. And which center predominates obviously depends on whether we're talking about the materialist, the intellectualist, or the initiate. So neurocardiology is a burgeoning science now that is showing the primacy of the heart, not just as a pump, but as the seat of consciousness. And the root cause of this brain-mind conundrum is this, as the great neurologist said, and that we have to realize that the instrument depends on the performer, but the performer is not the same as the instrument. So by analogy with the pianist and the piano, the mind corresponds to the pianist and the brain the piano. Obviously, if either be deficient, so will be the music. But if the blood, bone, and flesh of the human brain secrete thought, then the wood, string, and violin secrete music, never mind the pianist or the violinist. Moving to a close, I've summarized, insofar as one can on a sheet of paper, the fundamentals of the perennial philosophy from the standpoint or through the eyes of occultism, science, esotericism, and the Hermetic axiom. And here we see how East meets West. This diagram you will recognize in the esoteric writings of Blavatsky, showing the three stages for the descent of man. And here you have the same according to Sankhya philosophy. I'm always trying to show the unity of the great teachings from the East or the West, modern or ancient. Volume 4 comprises further material and profiles on these great people. And to help the reader in these 4 volumes, there are navigational aids and literary aids, a ribbon marker to help you find the last page you were reading, and an index of 104 pages. So to close with 2 examples of limitlessly unfolded consciousness. Firstly, Isaac Newton, his mathematical papers that were assembled in 1936, 8 huge volumes, not penguin-sized books. And this was all in addition to his other work on all of these subjects. And it is really a fact that Newton barely slept, as Lord Keynes pointed out, sometimes 2 hours a night, sometimes not at all. And my next example is a young man at the age of 35 who landed up in a pauper's grave. This was what Mozart had to cope with in the last 11 months of his life. And this is what he produced in the last 11 months of his life. The whole of the magic flute, the Clemenza di Tito, the clarinet concerto, and all of this. And the next time you have a headache and don't wish to do any work or complete your writing, just bear in mind that all of this was composed by Mozart in 4 months, while suffering from all of this. But it did not come easily. He was a prodigy of nature. But it is a mistake to think that my practice of my art has become easy. For what Mozart, Newton, and all the great luminaries have shown is that the soul of man is indeed immortal, with no limits, and only limits are what we put on ourselves, because each man is his own absolute lawgiver, the dispenser of glory or gloom to himself. So thank you very much for journeying with me on this voyage of limitless consciousness.